Hello wonderful world, Elaine here and welcome back to my channel. I have been on such an audiobook kick lately that today I figured I would make a video recommending some of my favorite audiobooks. So there seems to be this constant debate online about if audiobooks count as reading and if you can count them towards your reading goal for the year. What I say to that is, who cares? If you're reading, if you're having fun, if you're absorbing the material, then to me that counts. Me personally, I do count audiobooks in my Goodreads goal because I do feel like I'm absorbing the material, I can tell you exactly what happened, and I'm engaging actively with the text. I feel like what I see in my head when I listen to an audiobook is what I see in my head when I read the book as well. That being said, I did see a study that says your brain is activated the same if you're listening or reading. However, you have to be actively listening for your brain to be activated the same way. So if you're working on a really challenging task that takes a lot of brain power while trying to listen to an audiobook, you're probably not going to actually absorb and engage with the material. So that's my one stipulation, is I tend to listen to books while I'm doing something more mindless. My favorite pastime is audiobook walks. So just like walking for miles and listening to an audiobook. I like to do chores, cook, clean, and especially I love to color while listening to audiobooks. But if I try to listen to a book while I'm doing something for work or school, it's just not going to work out. I'm not going to be able to pay attention to one task over the other. I'm going to totally focus in on work, and then I'll realize 20 minutes later that I haven't listened to a single thing that the audiobook has said. So for me, I tend to listen to audiobooks with activities that don't require as much brain power, and that's why I count them, because I do feel like I'm hearing everything the narrator says, I'm seeing in my head what's going on, and I'm actively engaging with the work. So that's why I choose to count them towards my goal, but also who cares? Like, there's no reward or punishment at the end of reading a book. It's for fun, it's to learn and to grow. So if you're listening to an audiobook and having a great time, that's all that matters. So for this video, I have 8 audiobooks that I want to talk about. I tend to listen to a lot of nonfiction and memoirs when it comes to audiobooks, so I am quite heavy with that category, but I have a couple fiction ones that I wanted to throw in there. So we'll start with nonfiction. The first one I want to talk about is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. This is one of the best books I've read so far this year. It's absolutely 5 stars. It's amazing. John Green chronicles the history of tuberculosis, and what I love so much about it is how he takes a human-centered approach. So he's telling you stories of people who are living with tuberculosis or who have lived with tuberculosis. He handles this complex issue with such care and passion, and I learned so much about healthcare, and not only healthcare, but how our health is so interconnected with everything else in the world. One of my favorite things that really stuck with me in this book is that towards the end he talks about an experience he had where he stepped on a nail and he needed to go to the hospital to get a tetanus shot. Well, in order for that to happen, he had to have transportation to get to the hospital. The hospital had to have electricity because tetanus shots need to be refrigerated. There needed to be trained nurses that could give him the shot, and he needed to have insurance to be able to pay for the shot, or some sort of money, right? And so this book talks about tuberculosis, yes, but it also talks about how it is so interconnected with everything else in the world. It talks about how you can't just fix one thing. It's all these systems in place and it all goes together, and I think that this book is just such a great read, but it's especially good in audiobook format because John Green is the one narrating it. And for me especially, I grew up with John Green. I grew up watching his crash course videos, and I grew up reading his books like The Fault in Our Stars. And so his voice is just such a large part of my formative years, and so getting to hear it again as an adult was just really special, and I think he does such a great job of narrating it. Another nonfiction that I have is The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Allison Barr. Sounds like a lot. It is kind of a lot. It is about the history of women in evangelical church teachings. Yeah, it's kind of heavy, but I did really enjoy it because it talks about how Christianity, well, specifically modern Christianity, presents how men and women are supposed to be complementary and women are the supportive role to the man's role. The author kind of proves how the Bible never said those things, and the author is an evangelical Christian herself, and so she's actually calling out her own religion and saying what we're teaching young women is not what God intended. Very interesting. I myself am not super religious, so this was a very interesting read, especially growing up in the South around a lot of Baptist teachings. I don't know, I've kind of seen these teachings in action, and so having this woman disprove them and present a alternative was very, very fascinating. And it was actually really cool to learn about women in the Bible. I feel like I could name a lot of men who are in the Bible. And I didn't really grow up going to church, but I feel like I could still name a lot of dudes. But I don't think I could name as many women and tell you their stories. And so she kind of presents these stories and talks about how through translations of the Bible, stories have been changed and words have been changed to take away power and the importance of the role women played in the Bible. Very, very fascinating. And then the last nonfiction book in this category, because there's more nonfiction coming, but the last nonfiction book that I want to talk about right now is She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement. This is by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. They are Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalists who broke the Harvey Weinstein story. This book was cool to read as a woman who was growing up. Oh my gosh, it's getting so dark. This book was cool to read as someone my age because I was a teenager when all of the Me Too movement things were happening, so I was definitely dialed in, but I don't think I was as connected to it as I am now. So these two journalists kind of chronicle how they were able to find survivors of Harvey Weinstein's abuse and convince them to go on the record and to break this story in order to inspire more women to speak up about the harassment they felt. And it chronicles their whole experience as investigative journalists trying to break and uncover this story, and then it goes into the implications that Harvey Weinstein and these women coming forward had for society and how it kind of ignited this whole Me Too movement. This is also super heavy, but I think it's a must-read for women especially, and it talks about the importance of sharing your story, but then there's also the whole journalism edge of trying to be the first one to break this story and trying to convince people to go on the record when they're scared, and how they kind of managed those two things along with being really sensitive and responsible about the story because women's lives were at stake. The audiobook narrator for that one is really fantastic. It's really engaging. Okay, my next category also is nonfiction, but this is specifically memoirs. So I have 3 memoirs that I think are really well narrated, just really great memoirs in general. So the first one is Educated by Tara Westover. So it tells the story of Tara, who grew up in Idaho in a devout Mormon household. So Tara never stepped foot in a classroom until she was 17 because her parents did not believe in public education. They thought it was a conspiracy to brainwash and change kids. So she was forced to be homeschooled and help with her parents' business by doing manual labor. What I really enjoyed about this memoir is that it talks about the importance of knowledge and learning because your views on the world are completely different based on what you were taught in school. So for example, when she went to college, she did not know what the Holocaust was. And so her worldview and her opinions on things completely changed when she learned about the Holocaust and slavery and these things that her parents had kept hidden from her. I just think this was such a good story to remind you of how important getting an education is and how privileged we are, or I am, to have access to public education. I grew up with my mom as a teacher and my grandma was a teacher, and so I think I've always kind of really appreciated what education is and how lucky I am to access it. But reading stories like this, you realize just how much your teachers and the material that you are learning impacts your entire worldview and also what you do in life. I will say this book has a lot of trauma and pain, and so just know that going into it. But I do think that the narrator does such a great job at telling this story. I don't know, I think I was just so interested in it because it's hard to believe that these kinds of things are happening in my own country. I don't know. Her life was just very different than mine. Seeing who this woman was at the start of the story and when she was born and the family that she was born into versus who she is now, she had the most amazing arc and growth, and a lot of that was because of school and because of knowledge. And this is a memoir, so all of it's real, and I think the audiobook is just really well done. Okay, another memoir that I think is really well done is Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. This is just him telling his life story and giving advice and tips on how he thinks to best succeed in the world. The reason I love this one so much is just because he's the one narrating it. I love when audiobooks are narrated by the writer, and especially Matthew McConaughey because his voice is so unique and fun to listen to and engaging. He also could read the book in the way that he intended it to be read since he is the writer. If you've ever wanted to know more about Matthew McConaughey and how he got to where he is and what his family and stuff was like growing up, definitely check this out. But he also does leave you with some good wisdom and tips on success. This one's just really fun and fast and easy. The last memoir I want to talk about is Dear America, Notes from an Undocumented Citizen by Jose Antonio Verges. So Jose is a journalist who grew up in America. He was brought to America by his family when he was 12 years old. And when he was 16, he went to get a driver's license and he learned that his green card was fake. So this memoir talks about his experience growing up as an undocumented American, and he kind of flips on its head what it means to be a citizen and presents a new definition. I would recommend this book to anyone who's ever asked, well, why don't immigrants just go become citizens? Like, why don't they just go get their citizenship? I think this book perfectly lays out why it is not that easy, why it's actually really expensive and challenging, and how they kind of, I say they, but how those in power keep it that way. There's a reason that it is so hard and expensive and confusing to become an American citizen. It is not as easy as one might think. And so if you've ever asked questions of, I don't understand why people don't just come here legally or do it the right way, or why they don't just go to the courthouse and become a citizen, if you've ever asked those kind of questions, or you know anyone who's asked those kinds of questions, I think that this is a great book to read. Again, this memoir is narrated by the author, so he can read it in the way he intended it to be read. And it is super emotional, it's super well written, and it doesn't feel like a history textbook or anything. It's very easy to read. He's just telling you his story, and so again, he's adding this human element, and I think it helps kind of create empathy and connection between the reader and the writer. I just think this is a really well done audiobook, especially with everything going on right now in the world. Sometimes we have a tendency to undervalue learning. Going back to educated, sometimes we can feel kind of helpless and powerless because in America there are all these men with guns. And what am I supposed to do to help people when there are scary men with guns? But I think we forget that sometimes learning and just listening to other people's stories is one of the best things that you can do to create change, because the more that we understand about people and the systems in place, the more equipped we are to actually go and do something to create that change. Anyways, little rant, but I think that this is a really good book if you're interested in learning more about immigration in America and the fear and anxiety that comes with being undocumented. Okay, I have a couple fiction books that I quickly want to touch on before my camera overheats from the sun. Oh my gosh. Scotland weather. So the first fiction book is Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. This is probably one of the best produced audiobooks I've ever listened to. It was so engaging and immersive. So Listen for the Lie is a murder mystery. The main character Lucy's best friend was murdered and they don't know who did the murder, but everyone assumes it was Lucy. So it's 5 years later. Lucy's never been arrested because there wasn't enough evidence, but Lucy has amnesia from that night. She has no idea what happened, no idea who killed her best friend. She just wants to forget about it and move on. But this guy who runs a true crime podcast decides to dig into the story and figure out what happened. And so because of the podcast, the public is interested once again in this case, and Lucy is forced to confront the past and figure out what happened to her best friend once and for all. The reason I recommend reading this as an audiobook is just because of the production. So there are snippets from the podcast, from the True Crime Guys podcast, and there is theme music, and there's a different voice actor, and there's interviews. And I feel like reading it, like sure, it would say this is a podcast and it would tell you who's saying what, but listening to it was so cool because I was reading a book, right? But then there was also like clips from this guy's podcast, and so it felt like, it almost felt like a true crime podcast when I was reading the novel. And it was just such a well done audiobook. I literally read it so fast. I listened to it when I was at the gym. I would go on so many walks. It was so fun. The story was really addictive as well. Like I wanted to know what happened so bad. Lucy also has interesting thoughts, and so the way that they narrated her inner thoughts about like killing people was so engaging and well done. I just think this narrator was really good, and like I said, the production with including clips from the podcast and the interviews, just fantastic. I don't know, I thought it was one of the best audiobooks I've ever listened to. And then the last fiction book I want to talk about is actually two. So there is an author, her name is Leanne Slade, and she writes audiobooks for Audible. So these two are technically Audible originals, which is a bummer. I don't have Audible anymore. I try to use pretty much Libby for my audiobooks, so these are on Libby, which is unfortunate. But if you subscribe to Audible, you are in luck, because The Rebound and The Glitch are two of the funnest romance books I've ever read slash listened to. They have celebrity narrators, so The Glitch is narrated by Daisy Edgar Jones and Sam Claflin, and The Rebound is narrated by Claudia Jessie, who's Eloise from Bridgerton. All three amazing voices, amazing voice actors. And Leanne Slade does frazzled English woman like nobody. So The Glitch is a second chance romance with a little bit of magic, and The Rebound is fake dating and like workplace romance. So really fun tropes there. And then Daisy Edgar Jones, Sam Claflin, and Claudia Jessie, are you kidding? If you have Audible, you really gotta check those out. They're really, really fun. Anyways, I am a reformed audiobook reader, okay? I used to not be into audiobooks. I'm not the best at auditory learning, especially in like high school. I never considered myself an auditory learner, and then within the past couple years, I've really latched on to audiobooks. I think they're such an inclusive and accessible way to read, and it allows me to make boring tasks more fun, like putting away laundry. I literally hate folding laundry. It's like the worst thing in the whole world. But when you put an audiobook on, just makes it so much better. Audiobook walks are like one of the only ways that I can truly like disconnect from the world and get out of my own head for a little bit. So walking a couple miles, popping on an audiobook, I just think that that really grounds me and allows me to like de-stress. So I've recently become such a big fan of audiobooks. If you're new to them, I hope you give one of these a try. Let me know if you check one out. If you've got a favorite audiobook from me, please put it in the comments. And I hope wherever you are, happy reading slash happy listening, because books are books, and why are we being pretentious about it? I will see you guys oh so soon, and thanks for watching.